Welcome to the Kwok and Roll podcast. My name is Kwok Pui Lan. Today's guest is Jonathan Tran, who teaches at Baylor University. Jonathan, can you share with us what is racial capitalism?
Asian Americans and the Spirit of Racial Capitalism is a book I wrote about racial capitalism. Racial capitalism is the idea that if you want to understand race and racism, you need to understand the larger political economy that gave birth to it. And so the book is the attempt to explain this. It's also a critique to say that those who have tried to understand race and racism, absent understanding capitalism as its particular political economy, will tend to miss certain things about it.
How does racial capitalism help us to understand the world today?
So sometimes when we think about race and racism, which is clearly prevalent in our world today, that it's hard to understand our world without understanding and thinking about race and racism. So to think about the world through the lens of racial capitalism is to look at the particular roles that race plays in our society. So one of the ways I tend to try to talk about it is like when you drive around your city, how do you think about the breathtaking forms of inequality and injustice? One way to think about it is to think about race narrowly, that there are in our world those who are racist towards others. And that is undoubtedly true. But it's also the case that the race operates in a very particular way. As I try to say in the book, racism persists in our society because racism works. That is, it enables a system of breathtaking inequality to continue precisely by using racial categories to justify and facilitate the inequality. And so I drive to a certain part of my city, in my case, Waco, Texas, or Atlanta, or Boston, and you look at certain forms of inequality, whether it be in housing or education, access to employment, healthcare issues, and there are clear and obvious forms of inequality. Some people have access to healthcare, others do not. Some have access to health, housing, or jobs, others do not. Rather than asking the question, how have we created a society of such inequality, and why don't we change it? Instead, we use race to justify it. We say, oh, it's because those people are X or those people are Y, where the racial category X or Y does the work of legitimizing it and therefore further facilitating it in our world.
Since the inauguration of Trump, there has been chaos and uncertainty. How are you feeling about the country these days?
In some ways, when I wrote the book, I tried to give us a way to anticipate what's happening to us politically. So if we reverse a little bit to say 2015, at that point in America, we're talking a lot about race and racism. We're clearly on the agenda of the American political conversation. This is because we're in the midst of, say, Black Lives Matter 1. We would be headed in a few years to Black Lives Matter 2, where Black Lives Matter became not simply a national issue, but a global one. And we tended to talk about race in pretty narrow terms, right? We tended to talk about the brutality of what, say, the police do to Black people in narrowly racial terms. The problem with that is that it didn't get to the larger realities of race and racism. On the one hand, it captured something about anti-Blackness, and therefore it offered certain kinds of remedies or certain kinds of solutions. But what it captured tended to be narrow, and therefore the remedies and solutions tended to be narrow. One of the effects of that movement was to suggest that the problems were simply racial and that we could fix our society simply by addressing race issues. Of course, one of the problems that we came to understand, say 10 years later, was that we left vast swaths of inequality unaddressed in our society, not simply the vast forms of inequality against Black and brown people, but also the forms of inequality directed regularly and generationally against poor white people. This created a political culture in which someone like a Donald Trump could come along and exploit what we on the left left unaddressed insofar as we thought about race and racism narrowly without addressing larger questions of political economy. Once you had a situation like that, it just was a matter of time before Donald Trump came and exploited it. Just-sided nationalists have often exploited these things. And so what we're seeing is the downstream effect of two kinds of realities. One, the ongoing forms of racial capitalism and exploitation and domination that have been at the heart of this society and this nation for hundreds of years. And we're seeing the downstream effects of a political left that didn't quite get its hands around the whole of the problem. And so what I want us to think about in these pretty frightening times is not simply the problems on the right, but how we on the left need to think clearer and more powerfully about the present moment.
Can you share with us a little bit about your intellectual trajectory? Your first book was about the war in Vietnam and the theologies of memory. Your second book was about Foucault, and then you wrote about Asian Americans and the spirit of racial capitalism. Why this trajectory, or were there particular reasons leading you to do the different book projects?
The Vietnam War book, as you mentioned, came out of my dissertation. And in the dissertation, I actually don't know what I was thinking, and I have no idea what my dissertation director, Stanley Hauerwas, was thinking in allowing me to take on a project like this. What the dissertation and what the book became was the attempt to try to make sense of the habits of speech that led to the Vietnam War. In other words, how do we Americans talk about things like communism, about time, about other countries, about notions of war, forms of violence? How do we talk about them in our regular day-to-day habits of speech? And how do those habits of speech over time cultivate a sense that on the one hand, time is running out, say the communists are going to take over, and therefore, in order to save ourselves from time running out, we need to enact forms of violence. In other words, I was trying to ask the question, how could a country that talks so readily about freedom and independence and democracy prosecute a war in which 3 million civilians would die and would be prosecuted in a way where war atrocities became associated with that very war? How could we do that? And then I want to know, how did a country that narrated its history largely as a sequence of victorious wars, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, eventually the Civil War, World War I and World War II, how did a country that narrated its history through a series of victorious wars then come to talk about a war that most people thought it had lost, which is what the American war in Vietnam was? And so I was trying to think through those issues. I wrote the book, and then that naturally led to questions of how we tell history, how we inhabit time, how we think about the other. And this was maybe the most influential theorist of our social life, our most important and broad sweeping critical theorist, Michel Foucault, became the natural next person to help me think about that. That eventually led at the end of the trajectory to where I am now, as you can imagine, and you can probably already tell, large to thinking about how language works and how language works and forms our social habits, how it forms our political imagination, our social imagination. And then for me as a theologian, how our Christian ways of thinking and talking and seeing, that is, how our Christian habits of speech, we tend to be prone to.
Who are the scholars or authors that influenced you most?
I'm like most American theologians, I'm influenced by the giants of my field, Stanley Hauerwas, the great legends of Christian ethics and theology, the traditions of Christian theology, Augustine and Aquinas, but also the giants of my age. Kwok Pui Lan is certainly one of them. Willie Jennings, Jay Carter were two of my teachers. And so it was always a balance between the more traditioned and the broad traditions of Christian thinking, but also the current folks who had set the trajectories long before I got there. And so, for example, when I wanted to think about Vietnam, or later on when I wrote an essay about, say, Korean plastic surgery, I want to know how Asian theologians had thought about these questions. And so that's how I discovered your work and found you as a teacher and mentor through your writing. And so In this sense, I'm a very normal, regular kind of theologian. I ride on the shoulders of giants, and I take the concepts and ways of thinking, but also the very powerful forms of political hope that my teachers and mentors have taught me. Again, oftentimes I know these people. Sometimes I read about these people. Sometimes they are living and contemporaneous with me. Sometimes they did their work hundreds and sometimes thousands of years ago.
What do you see as the future of Asian American politics?
I feel like a lot of our politics, and especially our politics that tend to be adjacent to ascriptive identities, including racial identities, I feel like we're in a moment of incredible transition. In fact, I've wondered whether my friends on the center left have read the writing on the wall. I think a lot of my friends on the left, and I count myself as a card-carrying member of the left, I think my friends on the left haven't quite captured the moment we're in. I think many of them think that we're in a moment of where a mistake has happened and that history will self-correct itself. And they tend to think that they're on the right side of history and that history will necessarily, when it corrects itself, will correct itself in their favor. And so they see 2016, 2024 as maybe aberrations, that things are going to click back to normal, as if normality was ever a good thing in American life. Rather, I think we're in a new political season. And if we rely on the old forms of thinking about our politics, including the old forms of prescriptive racial identity, we're going to miss something. I think maybe what we have to learn from actually is those on the right. Go back to 1972 and 1973, Roe v. Wade. What does the right do when they definitively lose in the courts on the issue of abortion? What they started to do, right, they didn't sit around and expect history would click back in their direction, nor did they sit around with their hands turned up and cry about it. They just started to organize. They organized in ways that I think those on the left would consider unsavory, maybe unethical, but they organized. And what we're seeing now is the effects of 50, 60 years of organizing. Again, it was organizing things like dark money, different political think tanks, organizing within the margins of the academy, which tended to be dominated by the left over the last 50, 60 years. And they produce pretty radical forms of politics. I think we on the left need to quickly pivot to this. What are the new modes of politics? Not simply a return to a set of politics that we've been used to and that we've had the privilege of dominating for many decades, but we need to begin to look out for new forms of political organizing. And I think these will be forms of coalitional life, often related to not simply racial identity, but collective new forms of racial identity, where the old forms of racial identity around things like diversity have given way. This is clearly, in my mind, have to be about a kind of multiracial democracy, oftentimes located far from the seats of power. The left, of course, has become too cozy with power, especially the media elites, the academic elites, the managerial classes. We're going to have to get much closer to the ground than we're used to and return to the heart of the most radical forms of freedom struggles that marked a prior season of the political left. I think once we start doing that, not only will we be less terrified by what's happening now, but we will find new forms of hope. As for Asian Americans, I think we've already begun to do that. You think about the role that Asian Americans played in 2016, 2020, 2024. On the one hand, a mobilizing of the left towards a certain kind of democratic politics. But my sense is that Asian Americans will be some of the quickest to realize, hey, we need to begin to do different kinds of things. And my guess is that the reason we will be able to make that pivot fast is because we've always been a migrant people. We've always had to make do. We've always had to find forms of organizational, political life that matches our lives on the ground as migrants.
We are seeing a realignment of world politics, and you have contributed a chapter to the book that I edited, Trans-Pacific political theology. Can you tell us why using this trans-Pacific frame is important to look at world politics today?
Yeah, so the realignment we're witnessing has to do with the combination of political entities we, in the previous generations, didn't tend to think go together. So, for example, the incredible emergence of the technological industries, the communication industries, the development of social media, those mostly emerged, say, in the popular imagination, mostly on the left. And that's why you saw the first companies to fly the Black Lives Matter banners on their headquarters were companies like Google or Apple. Powerful technology-based corporations that in many cases exceeded the power and grasp and scope of most and many nation states throughout the world. We tended to think they were in the left. Even when we think about Elon Musk, we may forget in the current moment that he largely started on the left. He used to talk about Tesla as a company related and aligned with the concerns of the left, namely around questions of environmental stewardship and creation care. But we've seen a pretty radical shift. The media conglomerates have either washed their hands clean of politics as they realize the messiness of them tying themselves to political entities, or there's been a pretty radical shift to the right. Now, the right, of course, itself has been massively realigned. The right of George W. Bush and his father, the senior Bush, of a kind of conservatism tied to a view of a broad global order, that's basically forgotten now. The politics of a kind of compassionate conservatism of a Mitt Romney, largely forgotten. Rather, we're seeing on the right some consolidations of power in relationship to what we used to align and think of in terms of the left, say the organization of labor, anti-capital, community-based localisms, out of which new concerns for the environment or the globe, forms of nationalism and protectionism now combined in these eerie, strange ways with the explosive power of technological or technology-based corporations. So this is a massive new world we're living in. Part of the problem for us is it's happening so fast, by some accounts, in the matter of a couple of years. It happens so fast that we're just trying to get our heads around it. All the while, forms of political organizing and mobilization are happening right under our nose. And oftentimes we're using old categories to describe these new realities. And so how do we make sense of what's happening? Again, the idea for me is that those on the center left or say the far left, those who are encouraged and find their hope in things like democratic socialism, in my case, democratic socialism bound out of the metaphysical imagination of kind of tradition Christianity that imagines the world as not simply rife with forms of power, but power itself as part of a gift economy related to the gospel of Jesus. If we can begin to pivot that way and then to look for forms of organizing and politics on the ground, then we have room for hope. But this will require in our minds and in our imagination coming to terms with the massive forms of political alignment. In other words, if we keep on using the same old categories for a new day, we'll find them inadequate to the task in front of us.
You are writing a book with Vincent Lloyd. Can you share with us what the book is about?
Vincent Lloyd, for those who are not familiar, is one of the great singular minds in American theology. Vincent is always going to be a thinker possessed of genius, partly because he just so refuses to accept the status quo in terms of how we tend to think about things, whether they be about theology, about philosophy, about politics. Vincent just thinks on a different bandwidth than the rest of us. And so, of course, then when it comes to categories of race or politics or Christian theology and ethics, Vincent is always going to be doing his own thing. I have to admit, I find that kind of thinking, that unorthodox kind of thinking, both frightening because Vincent is so smart and you can never anticipate what he's going to say or think. But I also find it deeply attractive. It allows me to do the very pivoting that I just described earlier. And so when I encountered Vincent's work 2 decades ago and his work in the 2 decades since, I always find something fresh invigorating, challenging, paradigm shifting, if not paradigm smashing. And so at some point, I and Vincent got into a conversation about writing a book together. And it was, again, that combination of a frightening prospect, but a deeply attractive one. And so I thought, of course, I have to do this. I want to do it, but I also have to do it because I knew that if Vincent and I got into a room together, that as a Black man and an Asian man, we would be forced to think about things that we may not want to on our own. But it would also be the case that we would be allowed to say things that we could not say on our own, exactly because we had someone in front of us that inspired us, that we had to be accountable to, that we're going to be people who force each other to think hard about it. In some ways, this, I think, is a picture of what a multiracial democracy is supposed to be about. People who hold obligations to one another to make each other better than they would be on their own. And I know that certainly is the case with me thinking through these matters with Vincent, that he's going to make me better than I would be on my own, think harder, clearer, more astutely, more radically than I would on my own. And so that's the idea. So the book is a book we're working on with Cambridge University Press, and it's going to be called very austerely Race and Christianity. We're going to try to get clear about some concepts of race. And we're really going to ask this question. Sure, there are major problems with being racially identified. Sure, there are major problems with race. I just earlier started this conversation by talking about the way race is used to justify breathtaking forms of inequality, exploitation, domination. And yet, we live raced lives. I could not avoid being thought of as Asian if I wanted to. I also know that in Asian life, just like in Black life, there are incredible forms of human dignity, of human ingenuity, of human beauty. And so how do we both acknowledge the problems of race, what we call in the book crucifying race, but also look for race as a resurrected form of life? So the book is actually going to try to advance and articulate a theological, constructive account, a positive account of race. We're not going to skirt the issue. We're going to try to jump in. We're going to try to find it in the traditions of Christian thought, whether it be resourcement thought or liberationist thoughts. We're going to try to find it in scripture. We're going to try to find it in a natural theology or even a natural law of race. And we're going to try to say, we all have to live racial lives. We can't avoid it. How best might one try to live it?
I can't wait to read the book. For those who are starting their intellectual journey for our students, what kind of advice you will give them?
So I'm also writing at the same time a book with my mentor and teacher, Stanley Hauerwas, on political theory and how political theory from its founding moments in the West, specifically Plato and Socrates in the Republic, how political theorizing never was the attempt to think about what is the most pure or perfect form of politics. Rather, political theorizing works something like Christian theodicy. That is, how do we go on after suffering? The suffering and tragedies that befell Plato and Socrates are not that different than the tragedies and difficulties compelling us in this present moment, as we've already talked about. And so Stanley Hauerwas and I try to give an account of political theory. That is, how do we imagine political life in light of tragedy? And we're going to try to reframe what he has said for decades about the church as exactly this form of political theorizing. I bring that up to say, my big word of advice to younger scholars is to read as much as you can, to learn as much as you can, to have as wide a scope, to know as much as you can. Theologians are different than other scholars. We don't think we need to know just the social sciences. We don't need to know, say, as biologists, simply about cellular mitosis. We feel like we are responsible to answering the broad breadth of what creation is about. Because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do as theologians is talk about God by talking about God's creation. And this requires us to know a tremendous amount. This would go against the tendency of reading narrowly, of thinking narrowly. And oftentimes, unfortunately, this comes under the pressures of publication, of tenure, processes, of promotion processes, of getting a job, of graduate school. What that teaches us to do is to too narrowly, in order to get that article out, to get the book out, to get past your dissertation, to get past a promotion, to read very narrowly, to think very narrowly. Whereas I want to say the best thing about being a theologian is you are invited to read, think, see, listen as broadly as you possibly can, to fight the pressures that you need to be productive. And to be productive, you need to be narrow. Rather, I want to say that Christian theology is the invitation into the deepest, widest, most gift-structured form of creaturely life, to live lives with others, to live life with the ultimate other, that is God, in a way that nurtures and cultivates a capacious, generous mind. I think if young scholars can lean into that and work against the anxieties of those young scholarship years, then they will enter into the great gift of theology.
Thank you so much for joining me today. If you liked the episode, please subscribe. I will see you in the next episode.